It was exactly 10:15 a.m. on a Saturday when the structural integrity of my marriage finally collapsed. I didn't hear it snap, like a steel cable giving way under too much tension. I heard it rumble. It was the heavy, guttural churn of a diesel engine creeping up the quarter-mile stretch of my gravel driveway, shattering the perfect, unbroken quiet of a Pacific Northwest autumn morning. I didn't stand up. I didn't flinch. I just sat perfectly still in the worn oxblood leather armchair I've owned since 1998, holding a heavy ceramic mug of Twinings Earl Grey tea. I let the steam rise against my face, breathing in the sharp scent of bergamot, and watched through the expansive bay window of my cedar timber home. The sunlight was catching the dust motes in the air, making them dance in the silence of the living room, completely at odds with the ugly reality pulling up to my front door. Most men fear coming home to an empty house. I sat in a full one and realized I was entirely alone. Through the pristine glass, the morning sun hit the side of a massive 24-foot Isuzu box truck. Painted in bold forest green lettering across the corrugated aluminum siding were 5 words that explained everything I needed to know about the woman I had married: Blue Spruce Estate Liquidators. The truck's reverse alarm beeped in a steady, monotonous rhythm. It sounded less like a vehicle and more like a countdown clock to the end of my life as I knew it. Or rather, the life they thought I knew. Down on the driveway, playing traffic cop for the truck driver, was my stepson, Marcus. He's 32 years old, styles himself as an independent business consultant, and possesses the kind of unearned, smug arrogance that usually requires a trust fund. He was wearing his signature Patagonia fleece vest over a crisp white Oxford shirt, waving his hands with the exaggerated authority of a man who has never actually built a single thing of value in his entire life. He looked absolutely thrilled. He looked like a man who had just inherited a kingdom without ever having to swing a sword. The thing about thieves is they always mistake a quiet mark for a stupid one. And standing by the front porch steps, wrapped in a grey cashmere cardigan I had bought her for our 5th anniversary, was Claire, my wife. She held a heavy-duty aluminum clipboard pressed tightly against her chest. A silver ballpoint pen poised in her right hand. She was ready. She was prepared to inventory 35 years of my hard work, slap a barcode on it, and pack it into cardboard boxes. I watched her face through the window. There was no hesitation. There was no heavy guilt pulling at the corners of her mouth or slowing her movements. There was just the sharp, focused efficiency of a vulture picking a carcass clean before the midday sun gets too high. They both thought I was exactly 200 miles away. According to the meticulously detailed itinerary I had cheerfully printed out and left on the kitchen island, I was currently standing waist-deep in the freezing waters of the Deschutes River near Bend, Oregon, casting a fly line for steelheads. I had packed my 2018 Ford F-150 Lariat to the brim with gear. I had kissed Claire on the cheek. I had told her I loved her, squeezed her hand, and promised I'd be completely off the grid until Sunday night. She had smiled, patted my chest, and told me to catch something big. The moment my taillights disappeared down the road, she must have picked up the phone. You never truly know someone until you give them the perfect, consequence-free opportunity to destroy you. I took a slow, measured sip of my tea. It was still hot enough to burn the back of my throat, but I didn't mind. The sharp sting of it was grounding. It kept the engineer in me focused. For 40 years, I designed highway overpasses and suspension bridges. I understand load-bearing walls, stress fractures, and the exact mathematical moment a concrete structure will fail. Over the last few months, I had applied that same cold, calculating science to my own household. I had seen the microscopic cracks forming. I had felt the foundation shifting beneath my feet. But instead of acting like a frightened old man trying to patch a doomed structure, I simply stepped back, reinforced my own position in absolute silence, and let them bring the roof down on their own heads. Outside, the box truck hissed loudly as its air brakes engaged. The heavy rear doors rolled up with a metallic clatter that echoed through the tall Douglas firs surrounding my property. 2 large men in heavy work boots jumped down onto the gravel, pulling out thick, quilted moving blankets and heavy-duty steel dollies. Marcus clapped one of the movers on the shoulder, laughing at a joke, pointing a finger toward the massive custom oak front doors I had hung myself a decade ago. He was giving them the grand tour of the spoils. He was ready to clear out my antique power tools, my vintage Omega watch collection, the Persian rugs, the mid-century modern furniture, everything. They were going to strip this house down to the studs, declare me legally incompetent by Monday morning, and leave me rotting in a $1,200 a month linoleum-floored assisted living facility while they cashed the checks. That was their plan. It was an exceptionally good plan. It was just missing one crucial piece of information. I took another sip of my tea, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The heavy brass front door handle clicked, turning slowly as Claire unlocked it to let the scavengers inside. My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake. I felt nothing but the calm, dead-eyed clarity of a man who knows exactly how the math works out. I didn't say a word as the movers walked in with their dollies. I just waited for my wife to realize the men in the grey suits standing behind them weren't there to appraise the silver. To understand why my wife and her son felt so confident backing a 24-foot moving truck into my driveway, you have to understand exactly what kind of man they thought they were dealing with. They looked at me and saw a soft, grey-haired retiree with a generous pension and a fading memory. They saw an easy mark. They forgot they were dealing with a man who spent his entire adult life calculating breaking points. I am a man who measures twice, cuts once, and never builds on a shaky foundation. For 40 years, I worked as a lead structural engineer for the Washington State Department of Transportation. If you have ever driven an 18-wheeler over the I-90 corridor or taken your family across the suspension bridges spanning Puget Sound, you have trusted your life to my mathematics. I dealt in steel, concrete, rebar, and tension. When you build things that carry the weight of thousands of lives every single day, you learn very quickly that hope is not a strategy. Only facts matter. I poured that exact same meticulous obsession into building my sanctuary. In 2012, using the bulk of my life savings, I broke ground on a custom 4,200 square foot cedar timber home tucked into 10 heavily wooded acres near Snoqualmie, Washington. It is a masterpiece of craftsmanship, if I do say so myself. Vaulted ceilings anchored by massive Douglas fir beams, radiant floor heating beneath imported slate, and a wraparound porch that smells of pine needles and damp earth in the mornings. It was supposed to be the quiet finish line to a very loud, demanding life. Then came Claire. I met my second wife 8 years ago at a charity silent auction in downtown Seattle. I had been a widower for 5 years, living alone in my big cedar house, and the quiet had started to turn into a deafening ring. Claire was elegant, soft-spoken, and smelled of expensive vanilla. She poured a glass of Pinot Noir, laughed at my dry jokes, and made the house feel warm again. We married a year later. It was a comfortable, easy companionship. A good marriage is like a well-poured concrete foundation. It settles a bit over time, but it holds its ground against the weather. Ours was holding just fine, right up until her son, Marcus, needed a place to crash. Marcus was 32 years old, aggressively entitled, and utterly useless. He styled himself as an independent business consultant, a vague title that required him to pace around my back deck with his AirPods in, drinking my expensive Kona coffee, using words like synergy and bandwidth. As far as I could tell, his primary business consisted of having 0 actual clients while driving a leased 2021 BMW 3 Series he couldn't afford to put premium gas into. Some men build things with their bare hands. Other men just look for a finished house and complain about the color of the paint. Marcus was firmly the latter. For the first 2 years he lived in my guest wing, I tolerated him. I kept my mouth shut to keep the peace for Claire. But a man who pretends to work will eventually generate very real bills. In April of last year, the facade cracked. A catastrophic failure in some crypto-logistics startup, Marcus had heavily leveraged, left him staring down the barrel of severe financial ruin. The creditors were calling the house line. The collection letters were piling up in the mailbox. I came into the kitchen one Tuesday morning to find Claire weeping softly over her oatmeal, terrified that her son was going to face fraud charges. I didn't yell. I didn't lecture. I drove down to the Bank of America branch in Bellevue, sat down with the branch manager, and requested a cashier's check for exactly $65,400. I brought it home, placed it flat on the kitchen island in front of Marcus, and tapped it once with my index finger. I told him to clear the board, pay his debts, and never bring that kind of chaos into my home again. He slid the check off the granite counter without even looking me in the eye. He didn't say thank you. He just gave a tight, embarrassed nod and walked away. You can buy a man out of debt, but you can't buy him a spine. I thought that writing that check was a structural repair. I thought I was shoring up a weakness in the household, patching a leak to keep my wife happy and my home peaceful. I am generous, but I am not foolish. I watched them closely after that, waiting for the gratitude to set in. It never did. Instead, they looked at that cashier's check and came to a disastrous conclusion. They decided I was weak. I thought I was buying myself a quiet, peaceful retirement with a woman I cared for, but I was actually financing a slow-motion, hostile takeover of my own life. The betrayal didn't happen all at once in some explosive, dramatic confrontation. It seeped in slowly, like water trickling through a hairline fracture in a concrete abutment. It started with the small, easily dismissible things. In early October, my vintage 1968 Omega Seamaster, a watch I bought with my very first engineering bonus, vanished from my mahogany dresser. 2 weeks after that, a pristine set of vintage Makita power tools and a heavy-duty DeWalt plunge router simply evaporated from my detached workshop. I know exactly where every tool I own is placed. I respect my equipment. But when I asked Claire if she had seen them, she didn't act defensive. She just placed a warm hand on my shoulder, offered a soft, sympathetic smile, and shook her head. "Are you sure you didn't misplace them, sweetheart?" she asked gently. "You've been so forgetful lately. I let it go." But then the game escalated. I would hang my truck keys on the heavy brass hook by the mudroom door at 6 p.m. By 7 a.m., they would be sitting in the crisper drawer of the refrigerator. The house Wi-Fi password suddenly changed, locking out my laptop, and Claire would insist she hadn't touched the router in months. For exactly 3 days, I actually doubted my own mind. That is the true cruelty of gaslighting. It weaponizes your own mortality against you. It makes you question whether the beautiful life you built is slipping away through the holes in your own aging brain. But an engineer relies on data, not feelings. If the data doesn't make sense, you stop guessing and you run a diagnostic. I own a Browning Strikeforce trail camera that I use to track the Roosevelt elk that wander through the back edge of my property in the winter. One evening, I brought it inside, disabled the infrared flash, and tucked it neatly behind a decorative ceramic pitcher on the mudroom shelf. I placed my keys on the counter, locked the doors, and went to bed. The next morning, the keys were sitting inside the pantry next to the oatmeal. I didn't say a word. I pulled the SD card from the camera, plugged it into my computer, and watched the high-definition footage. There, at exactly 2:14 a.m., was Marcus. He tiptoed into the mudroom, grabbed my keys, and walked away with a smirk on his face. Later that same afternoon, standing quietly in the hallway outside the closed door of the home office, I heard Marcus talking to his mother. The words hit me like a 90-pound bag of wet cement dropped from a scaffold. "He's losing it, Mom," Marcus was saying, his voice dripping with an ugly, practiced concern. "We need to document this. A judge will see it. We have to protect his assets before he leaves the stove on and burns the whole place down. Some men find out the truth and fall apart. I am not that man." I walked into the kitchen, made a pot of black Kona coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and waited for them to leave the house for their afternoon errands. When the driveway was clear, I went to work. I walked straight into the office and opened Claire's antique writing desk. Tucked beneath a stack of unopened mail was a glossy, depressing brochure for a place called Sunset Meadows Assisted Care out in Renton. It was a $200 a month state-subsidized warehouse for the elderly. It was the kind of place that perpetually smells of industrial bleach, boiled cabbage, and quiet despair. Sitting right underneath that brochure was a neatly drafted, unstamped power of attorney document. It was fully written out, explicitly granting Claire absolute financial and medical control over my life. They weren't just stealing my tools to pay Marcus's debts. They were actively building a paper trail of my cognitive decline. They wanted to declare me legally incompetent, lock me away in a linoleum cage, and take the custom cedar house for themselves. The ultimate confirmation came 3 days later. I picked up the family iPad from the living room couch and noticed a notification bell on the shared digital calendar. I tapped it. There, sitting perfectly on the weekend of November 12th, the exact dates I had already booked for a steelhead fishing trip on the Deschutes River, was a block-scheduled event. It read Blue Spruce Liquidators, house emptying. I stared at the glowing screen for a long, quiet minute. All the melancholy, all the lingering love I had for my wife evaporated instantly. It was replaced by a cold, surgical clarity. They had the bait, the hook, and the net all ready to catch a frail old man. It's just a pity for them they were fishing in my pond. If you've ever had someone mistake your silence for ignorance or your kindness for weakness, hit that like button. Now, let me tell you how an old engineer designs a trap. An amateur reacts to a threat with emotion. A professional reacts with infrastructure. Over the next 2 weeks, I gave Claire and Marcus exactly what they wanted. I played the part of the fading patriarch with Oscar-worthy dedication. I actively forgot where I left my reading glasses. I asked Marcus the same question about the weather twice in one morning. I watched the triumphant, secret little smirks they exchanged over the kitchen island, completely unaware that while they were busy measuring my home for curtains, I was silently stripping the foundation out from under them. My first move was medical. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I drove into Bellevue to see Dr. Aris Thorne. Aris has been my primary care physician for 20 years. He knows every ache in my joints, and we've spent enough alternate Sundays on the golf course for him to know exactly how sharp my mind is. I didn't mince words. I sat on the edge of his crinkling exam table, looked him right in the eye, and told him the unvarnished truth about the trail camera, the assisted living brochure, and the moving truck. Aris didn't offer empty pity. He offered clinical precision. For the next 2 hours, I underwent every cognitive, neurological, and physical assessment he could legally administer. We drew blood, we did memory recall, we mapped my fine motor skills. 3 days later, his office handed me a thick, heavy stock document. It was a time-stamped, notarized medical affidavit explicitly detailing my perfect mental and physical health. You cannot argue with a piece of paper signed by a doctor, a notary, and the unyielding weight of the truth. With the foundation of my sanity legally cemented, I made my second stop. I drove my truck into downtown Seattle, parked in an underground garage, and took the elevator up to the 42nd floor to the offices of Harrison and Vance. At $450 an hour, Richard Harrison and his partners aren't the kind of lawyers who yell in courtrooms. They are the kind of lawyers who quietly dismantle your opponents before the gavel ever falls. I sat across from Richard's massive mahogany desk, placed my medical affidavit on the polished wood, and told him we needed to activate the fail-safe. This is the part of the story that Marcus and Claire never saw coming. They looked around my beautiful home and assumed I held the deed. It was a very logical, incredibly arrogant, and ultimately fatal assumption. I don't own my house. 10 years ago, out of a desire to leave something meaningful behind, after my first wife passed away, I created the Oak and Anchor Foundation. It is a fully registered charitable trust that funds full-ride structural engineering scholarships for bright, underprivileged kids. I quietly transferred the entire estate, the land, and the house into the foundation's name a decade ago. The greatest armor a man can wear is a secret nobody knows to look for. I am legally just a tenant. I retain a life estate, which gives me the right to live in the home until I take my final breath, but I do not own the fixtures, the timber, or the slate floors. Richard smiled a very cold, very expensive smile when I showed him the calendar alert for the estate liquidators. By attempting to empty the house, Marcus and Claire weren't just stealing from an old man. They were actively plotting to defraud a 501(c)(3) charity. I instructed Richard to draft a formal, legally binding 30-day eviction notice for my guests, citing a gross violation of the Foundation's bylaws. When the morning of November 12th finally arrived, the air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and damp earth. I methodically packed the bed of my truck. I loaded my rods, my waders, and a heavy Yeti cooler. Claire stood on the front porch, wrapped in a grey cardigan, holding a mug of coffee. Her eyes were bright, shining with the anticipation of a woman who believes she has just won the lottery. I gave Claire a kiss on the cheek, told her I'd be off the grid until Sunday night, and drove away, knowing I'd be back in exactly 4 hours to watch her world burn. I didn't drive 200 miles south to the Deschutes River. I drove exactly 2 miles down the highway to the Whispering Pines Motel. I paid $55 in cash for a room I had no intention of sleeping in. I sat in a sagging armchair, drank terrible lobby coffee, and waited for the clock to hit 10. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel, because what happened when that moving truck pulled up to my driveway is a masterclass in why you never ever poke a sleeping bear. At 9:45 a.m., I left the Whispering Pines Motel, turned my Ford F-150 back toward the Cedar House, and slipped through the private service road that cuts through the back acreage of my property. I parked behind the detached workshop, completely out of sight from the main driveway. I unlocked the mudroom door with a quiet click, walked into my own kitchen, and put the kettle on. The familiar whistle of boiling water felt like a battle horn. I poured a heavy ceramic mug of Twinings Earl Grey tea, walked into the living room, and sat down in my oxblood leather armchair. And that brings us right back to exactly 10:15 a.m., the Blue Spruce Estate Liquidators truck idling in the drive, the smug look on Marcus's face, the grey cashmere cardigan wrapped around my wife's shoulders. They were standing at the threshold of my home, ready to pillage the life I had built, completely oblivious to the trap snapping shut around their ankles. Out on the driveway, Marcus was talking to the liquidator foreman. He was a burly, no-nonsense guy in a high-visibility jacket whose workshirt read Sal over the breast pocket. Marcus was pointing toward the detached workshop, probably promising Sal first pick of my vintage Maquitas. Claire stood nearby, her pen hovering over the aluminum clipboard. Then the gravel crunched under a different set of tires. A sleek jet black 2023 Lincoln Town car glided up the driveway, its polished chrome catching the mid-morning sun. It pulled to a smooth, silent stop directly behind the massive box truck, blocking it in completely. The heavy doors of the Lincoln opened. Out stepped Richard Harrison, wearing a flawless charcoal grey Brooks Brothers suit, followed closely by his junior partner carrying a thick, legal-sized manila folder. They didn't look angry. They looked like reapers carrying a scythe made of paperwork. Marcus frowned, stepping forward, his Patagonia vest suddenly looking very cheap next to Richard's tailored wool. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice loud and obnoxious. "This is private property. We're in the middle of an estate liquidation here. Who the hell are you?" It was time. I stood up from my leather armchair, walked to the heavy oak front doors, and pulled them open. I stepped out onto the wraparound porch. The cedar floorboards didn't even creak under my boots. I brought my mug to my lips, the teaspoon clinking softly against the porcelain. Claire spun around. The aluminum clipboard slipped from her fingers and hit the gravel with a sharp, echoing clatter. All the color drained from her face, leaving her looking as pale as the heavy frost that coats the Douglas firs in late January. "Sweetheart," she whispered, her voice trembling. You're supposed to be in Bend." I didn't answer her. I didn't even look at her. I looked at my lawyer. Richard Harrison adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, opened the manila folder, and looked at Marcus. "My name is Richard Harrison. I represent the Oak and Anchor Charitable Foundation. And to answer your question, young man, you are standing on private property. Just not yours." Richard pulled a notarized copy of the deed and handed it to Marcus. Marcus took it reflexively, his eyes darting across the heavy black text. "As you can see," Richard continued, his voice calm, measured, and utterly devastating, "this property and all its fixtures were deeded to a 5013 charity exactly 10 years ago. My client only retains a life estate. Attempting to liquidate assets from this property constitutes an active conspiracy to defraud a charitable organization." Richard reached into the folder a second time and pulled out 2 crisp white envelopes. He handed one to Marcus and one to Claire. "Inside these envelopes you will find a legally binding 30-day eviction notice. citing a gross violation of the Foundation's bylaws. You have exactly 1 month to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you attempt to remove a single item that does not belong to you, we will bypass civil court and press immediate felony theft charges. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that only happens when someone's entire reality shatters into a million unfixable pieces. This is where the bystanders stepped in. Sal, the liquidator foreman, had been standing quietly by the open back of his truck. He wasn't a lawyer, but he was a man who worked for a living, and he knew a con artist when he saw one. Sal walked over, gently pulled the legal deed from Marcus's limp, trembling hand, and read the bold text at the top. He looked at the paperwork, looked at Marcus's pale, terrified face, and then looked up at me standing peacefully on the porch. Sal spat a thick wad of chewing tobacco onto the grass. He looked right at Marcus. "Son, you don't even own the dirt on your shoes." Sal turned to his crew, waved a heavy, calloused hand, and barked, "Pack it up, boys. We're done here. We ain't going to jail for this clown." Within 3 minutes, the massive box truck was rolling back down the driveway, leaving Marcus and Claire standing completely alone in the gravel, clutching their eviction notices. I never raised my voice. I never threw a single insult. I just took another sip of my tea, turned around, and walked back into my house. Watching Marcus's jaw hit the driveway was satisfying, but I promise you, it was nothing compared to the beautiful, unbroken silence that fell over my home the day the locks were finally changed. The 30 days that followed were a masterclass in awkward, suffocating silence. I didn't leave the house for a single night of that month. I had no intention of giving them a second chance to pillage my home while I was at the grocery store. I simply lived my life exactly as I always had, while they were forced to dismantle theirs around me. I would sit at the kitchen island every morning drinking my dark Kona coffee and reading the Seattle Times, while Marcus angrily shoved his designer clothes into cheap cardboard boxes. He didn't look me in the eye once. All that unearned bluster, all that corporate talk of synergy and bandwidth had completely evaporated. It left nothing behind but a scared, broke 32-year-old man who had finally realized his mother couldn't bail him out of a legal bear trap. A man's true character isn't revealed when he's holding the winning hand. It's exposed the moment the dealer takes his chips away. Claire tried to apologize, of course. About a week before their deadline, she found me out on the back deck. She manufactured some soft, practiced tears, talking about how the pressure had just gotten to her, how Marcus had convinced her I was truly slipping, and how she just wanted to protect me. I listened. I didn't interrupt her, and when she was finished pleading, I simply looked at her and asked if she had finished packing the guest bathroom yet. The tears stopped instantly. The artificial warmth vanished from her eyes. She finally understood that the bridge between us hadn't just been burned. It had been surgically demolished, and I was entirely comfortable standing on my side of the river. On the 30th day, a dented U-Haul van pulled out of my gravel driveway, carrying my second wife and her son out of my life forever. The moment their taillights disappeared past the tree line, I didn't celebrate. I didn't pour a glass of expensive whiskey or shout in triumph. I just picked up the phone and called a local locksmith. By noon, every deadbolt on the property had been swapped for heavy-duty commercial brass. When the locksmith's van pulled away, I stood in the center of my living room and just listened. You don't realize how much noise a toxic person makes in your life until they are finally gone and the ringing in your ears stops. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was heavy, warm, and absolute. The house was finally breathing again. As for Marcus, his arrogance demanded one final disastrous attempt at maintaining control. 3 months later, he managed to find a bottom-tier attorney willing to try and sue the Oak and Anchor Foundation for emotional distress and wrongful eviction. He actually thought he could bully a charity. He forgot who engineered it. Richard Harrison didn't just defeat the lawsuit, he utterly dismantled it in a single afternoon. In response, the foundation immediately countersued Marcus for the exact appraised value of the stolen vintage Makitas and my 1968 Omega Seamaster. Faced with a civil trial that would inevitably expose his theft to criminal prosecutors, Marcus completely folded. He is currently living in a damp, ground-floor studio apartment in a much rougher part of Tacoma, trying to pay off a massive legal settlement on whatever meager salary he can scrape together. Arrogance is a heavy mortgage, and eventually the bank always comes to collect. Claire's landing was equally hard. Stripped of the comfortable, secure retirement she had tried to steal, she had to face her own mountain of legal fees. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she is now working 6 days a week at a busy local diner right off Interstate 5. The woman who used to wear fine cashmere and sip Pinot Noir on my wraparound porch is now wearing a poly-blend apron and pouring drip coffee for long-haul truckers. I feel no malice toward either of them. Malice requires emotional energy, and I refuse to spend another ounce of mine on people who viewed me as nothing more than a balance sheet to be liquidated. Tonight, the rain is coming down hard against the Pacific Northwest timber. I am sitting exactly where I belong. The cedarwood fire is roaring in the stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering orange glow across the room. The only sound is the rhythmic, steady ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I have a glass of water, my reading glasses, and a worn paperback copy of Louis L'Amour's The Lonesome Gods resting on my knee. The storm outside can blow as hard as it wants. My foundation is secure. True power doesn't need to shout, and true justice rarely requires you to raise your voice. Sometimes it just requires a good lawyer, a solid foundation, and a hot cup of tea. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this.